in a project we call Climate Risk and Human Security. It is a real pleasure to have all of you here, and we're going to be introducing some of our special guests just now as we move into the discussion. We have a very big topic today, a very challenging topic in a challenging time, but we thought it's something that we have to get to. This is what we got this event to do today. And what we can promise you is that there will be some questions that are answered. There are many more questions that will be generated. There are some conversations that will take us to a reasonable point of comfort. And there are many more that will introduce even more discomfort. What we promise to do is to host a couple of these events in the course of the year so that we can engage with the gravitas around all of these issues. Just one logistical matter that when you take the floor, whenever you take the floor, please take the trouble to introduce yourself so that people will know who you are. We're not going to do a round of introductions right up front in a conventional way, because then we would have to do it for our friends online as well, and it could take a lot of time. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that in the tradition of the Institute of Security Studies, there are no holds barred. All opinions are welcome, all critique is welcome. You do have to substantiate your position. You have to be reasonably polite to the people around. But other than that, there is absolutely no restriction. We are very serious about organizing to genuinely examine the gravitas of the issues that we have to engage. In this case, we're talking to climate change. We're talking to climate action in 2025 and the implications of the big geopolitical movements around us. The second thing that I want to emphasize around this is that feel free, in accordance with what TJ has said, to put out the information that you gather and engage with in the event today. But out of politeness, if you are going to quote anybody specifically, please clear it with them. Otherwise, they might not talk. Okay, so with those short logistical notes, I think we're going to go right into the program. Please, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Right, we are now on a full slate. That's the Brazilian ambassador saying hello to the French ambassador. So I'm going to open with some introductory remarks. Our program is quite simple. It will then be followed by a panel discussion that Gaukelo Nkungeni, also from our project, will moderate. We are then going to go into an open discussion session with yourselves in the room and the folk who are joining us online. And David Villemer will manage that part of the program before Brian Mantlana from the CSIR and from the Presidential Climate Commission will draw some strings together for us at the end of these couple of hours around helping us with the memory of what we want to take away from today. So just a few words of introduction, and I certainly will not be too long because we want to hear from all of you. The first thing I want to point out, and this is something that came out of a discussion just before the start of the session, and I thought this is worth emphasizing, that there tends to be a feeling of despair around where we are in the world right now. A lot of it is justified, but none of it is new. In some shape or form, we have been in these uphills and roller coasters in many different forms in our own lives, and then a little bit of a look at history in the history of our time. And we need to empower ourselves in the moment around where we think we want to get to. And I want to emphasize this point that take you back to which was our first big promise of a global agreement around climate change. And some would argue, if you're old enough, that probably our best bet around what a global agreement could look like. And immediately after Kyoto, it fell off a cliff. And what we've been doing from then to Paris is trying to climb up a hill in a Sisyphean way with enormous difficulty. And then came Paris. And Paris gave us, at COP21, the Paris Agreement. And we then got a global agreement after many, many years in between. And what has happened since Paris has been a roller coaster ride. If I had to single out one country that has done a little bit more than some others around engineering this roller coaster ride, it would be the United States. The first country whose Senate, in a bipartisan way, across the board, in complete consensus, rejected the Kyoto Protocol, it was the United States Senate. You will remember this. And then almost immediately after Paris, there was a new president in the White House, the 45th president, that came in exactly the next year, 2016, January, and announced then already that the United States was going to withdraw from this global agreement right at its beginning. And he did it. He did it. In 2020, the United States withdrew from that agreement. 107 days later, in 2021, his successor, Joe Biden, got the United States back into the agreement after Obama was quite pivotal in assisting with the agreement in the first place. And then sure enough, in the 47th presidency, we're at the same place again. And the United States will not be part of the Paris Agreement. Shortly, Ambassador, after the COP in Belgium. It will be in January next year. And this has been some of the roller coaster ride that we've experienced. And while it's useful to point out the United States, please be clear, it's not exclusively the United States. But I want to offer just 3 points for us to kickstart this discussion that describes where we are in the world right now and how it relates to the Paris Agreement, to climate action in the world, and some implications for this continent. So the 3 points I want to pull out is the first point is that climate change isn't waiting for us to work ourselves out around what is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, nature does not really have feelings for human beings. I think nature appreciates that we're part of a dominant species in its biodiversity, but numbers-wise, I don't think we make that much of a difference. So Mother Earth continues to do and react to the things that are happening in her environment in a way that is particularly excruciating for where we are right now. 2024 has the average temperature at 1.5 degrees plus. This is the number we were talking about as a target for the end of the century. In fact, the century after that, the beginning of the 2100s. We're there already. It's not yet the average temperature because you need a good bunch of years to get that kind of algorithm in place, but the indications are there. And that wasn't even the highest temperature overall. It was the average. The highest was, in fact, in the Caribbean at 1.64 degrees plus. We are on a difficult pathway. And closely moving along with that global heating has been the phenomenon of extreme weather. And 3 things that characterize extreme weather in the world in 2025 is 1, it is absolutely irregular. The old parameters simply do not apply anymore. Those things that we were calling 1 in 120-year floods, we're having them every year. In some places in the world, we're having them more than once a year. The second is it's pervasive. There was a time we were talking about these extreme weather events in some parts of the world. There are no regions in the world now that don't have this pervasive phenomenon. And sometimes you have the extreme events that are sometimes on the opposite sides of a beam all happening in the same place. You have floods and droughts in the same area. It's astounding. And the third thing that's the descriptor is intensity. We haven't had this level of intensity of extreme events ever before. And it has a fundamental impact on the world. It has an economic impact. It has an obvious environmental and biodiversity impact. It has an impact on our social fabric, and it has a very important impact on security. The second point I want to make is that there are huge challenges in the geopolitical environment today. And in this community of practice and several others that haven't talked about this before, this is a daily conversation. This is a reality. One of those phenomena is the big oil pushback, the fossil fuel pushback. This is something we have been seeing for quite a while. It has become much more intense regularly, and the realization of the political power that's held by big oil and gas is becoming more and more obvious every day. Drill, baby, drill wasn't just a nice ditty. It actually became policy, and quite rapidly. So this is something that we have to deal with. The second thing that we have to be clear about is that the trade wars and the tariffs and the geopolitical shifting around these matters have grave implications for climate action. Because along with it, and the various wars that are being incubated all over the globe, means fewer and fewer resources, actual financial resources, but also political capital available to drive a climate action agenda in the world, much to our detriment. And we can't deny this. It is a grim reality. The new phenomenon that is rising, that is becoming more and more worrying, is the attack on science and the attack on knowledge. And this is grave. Inconvenient truths are in some quarters being eradicated from the public domain. And we have to worry about this, and we have to worry about this sincerely. The third point I want to make, however, is that in spite of these phenomena, in spite of these perturbations that have been happening over the last decade, there is something we should be celebrating at the end of this first decade of the Paris Agreement. And it's this. It's that in spite of the UN system as a whole and multilateralism in general being greatly weakened and challenged at this time, inside the UNFCCC, which includes all of our countries, there has not been a single veering away from the Paris Agreement. It still defines the agenda of what we engage, what we negotiate, and what we draw deals about. This is hugely significant. It is really, really important for us to remind ourselves frequently, if we have to, that the Paris Agreement is alive. It is under assault, but it is alive. And I don't think it's just surviving. I think it is thriving. And we look forward to listening to the viewpoints of our French ambassador around from the country that gave us the Paris Agreement, to the global community, and also from the ambassador of the country that's carrying that baton into November this year. And we're all hoping, sir, that Bellum will be the big flag that we can raise around climate action. So just a few things that come out of that. The NDCs are still alive. I know we have great skepticism about what NDC 2 is going to look like. But, you know, just a couple of cursory discussions with countries around the world, including this one, is the level of ambition has been arrested, but it has not been stopped. This is quite significant. You know, people are putting much more effort, I think, into the reality analysis compared to NDC 1. but it's talking about maintaining a reasonable level of ambition around climate action around the world. It has also expanded the frame beyond the mitigation issues into the adaptation issues as well. The second thing I think we can take heart from is that the various programs of action over the last 9 years of COP that have introduced and reinforced aspects of disaster risk reduction and adaptation in particular are very much alive. The third thing that we can pull out of this is that the global stocktake did happen. It did happen scientifically. It has been acknowledged by all of the countries in the world, and that has advised what the further actions are going to be. This is big stuff. It really is. And then in addition to that, at the Africa COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, at COP27, we had the birth of an idea and a decision on that idea that's been hanging around for decades, and that is the Loss and Damage Fund, which is also a big deal. And then alongside all of this are the various voluntary agreements like the energy agreements and the just energy transitions. So colleagues, it is a difficult road, maybe much more difficult than we envisaged when this was finally conceptualized and banked and applauded in November 2015. But there is a sufficiency of momentum 10 years down the line that says that we are on the right path. So to round up, before I hand over to Raquel, is what does this mean for this continent? This continent that has struggled for the longest time with having a disproportionate climate impact from a place that contributes still less than 4% of global emissions, from a place that still has a substantive fossil fuel asset that can power its engine of development. What does this mean for this continent, which is the most youthful in the world, that will be, in fact, the majority of the workforce in the world decades from now? And the point that we really need to sink in here is that we have to work collectively as a global community to genuinely empower Africa into a path of prosperity based on low carbon industrialization. Because if we do not, frankly, it's curtains for the world as a whole. So colleagues, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of this discussion. And we're looking forward to vibrant exchanges and inputs. And with that, I want to hand over to Raquel.
Thank you so much, Dhesigen, for that very sobering but very critical reflection of what the past decade has really looked like for the continent when it comes to climate action. As we may know, the current turbulence that we find ourselves in necessitates a well-rounded solution that is beneficial for the continent. And today, we have the pleasure of being joined by the Ambassador of France, David Martinen, where we will engage on what exactly has happened in the past 10 years and how can we position ourselves to move forward and let Brazil take the baton as the host of COP30, I beg your pardon. So I'd like to welcome the two ambassadors to kindly join us so that we can engage in a meaningful but very critical discussion on climate action. Okay. I'll firstly turn to Ambassador David Martin. Let us go back and reflect on Paris as a landmark agreement for the globe, but also Africa in particular as the most vulnerable continent to climate change. As a country that hosted COP21 and birthed the Paris Agreement, how can we ensure that we keep its ambition alive, but also that for Africa as a vulnerable region can achieve resilience amid the current geopolitical shifts and uncertainties?
Such an easy question for putting it. So first of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to be here. I had absolutely no part in the COP in Paris. I did nothing for that. By the way, neither Benedicto, because we were working together at that time on a completely different topic, but which is now related to it, because actually Benedicto and Ambassador Fonseca and myself were at that time both ambassadors for digital affairs, representing our countries. So obviously at that time, absolutely no clear relation with climate change and greenhouse emissions. But eventually, we have to acknowledge the fact that the exponential rise of use of AI and the necessity for the world's economy to rely on the data centers, which are extremely energy consuming, have indeed an impact, and that we have to mitigate at some point. Thank you very much. So I guess now I'm being heard on YouTube too. So to answer your question, I want to thank you, Professor Naidoo, for having us. Thank you, dear Tonette, for having us. I would just like to touch base on what you said earlier, in a very brief way. So yes, the American withdrawal will have dire consequences, especially from a financial standpoint. Okay, let's move on, right? we can't be stuck on that. I follow exactly your logic. Yes, it's sad. Yes, it's a problem, but let's move on. And to answer your question, obviously, I think we absolutely need to remember what are the key milestones of the Paris Agreement, because they are still alive, and we need to take stock of that. So first of all, the very important financial goals. In particular, what was the first initial $100 billion per year for climate action up to 2025, which has now become the $300 billion package from the macro objective dedicated to for the next decade. Again, indeed, the global limitation target of 1.5 Celsius degrees from pre-industrial levels, which, as you rightly said, we are already exceeding. And we need to take that into consideration. Hence, we are urged to act by the pace of climate warning, because as you rightly said, nature has no empathy for humans. None of us. So we can't bargain with nature. We can't bargain with the climate change. And obviously, as you also said, this global limitation has set the tone for what are the nationally determined contributions. Also, a clear and significant impetus to collectively work on adaptation policies, which have set the tone for a new fund, which was adopted during COP28 on the request of African countries, particularly regarding energy infrastructures. And also something that we don't always keep in mind, but the recognition of the link, very strong link between climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection, which eventually allows for the setup of new financing mechanisms for biodiversity conservation, such as major forests and oceans, which are obviously important carbon sinks, and we have to keep that in mind. I want to say that because in 1 month now, France and Costa Rica will host the next United Nations conference on oceans in Nice. Les dates, c'est quoi déjà?
9-13 juin.
From June 9th to June 13th in Nice. And South Africa will be represented by the Ministry of Environment, Diane George, and some mayors of big cities, notably the one deputy mayor of Cape Town. And we believe it's extremely important because we want to fasten the process of giving full legal force to this agreement, which obviously requires signatures and ratifications, which we expect from South Africa, both as soon as possible. Because once we're there, the international treaty on biodiversity protection beyond the national borders will have full force, which is obviously critical for the protection of biodiversity. And something else that we should keep in mind that came from the COP in Paris, which is the role played by science and technology, and particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we call in French the GIEC, G-I-E-C, to move forward on climate action. And this is absolutely crucial, especially in the current context that we can see in the US, where we see that scientists and researchers are, in a way, put on the bench. And that more dangerous than that, the fact that huge databases from universities are being erased, which is absolutely dramatic. So obviously we can see that the world and Africa have advanced, notably on the 5 priorities that were set out by the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, financing, access to technologies, and capacity building. And for that, so obviously the challenges are still ahead of us. I get what you said, Professor, on the fact that Africa has to face more hurdles, more significant hurdles than the most developed countries. We need globally to get out of coal. That is an absolute certainty. We know that for South Africa, it's a particular challenge for economic and also probably political and symbolic reasons, because we know that the role, we know the fact that coal is seen as a treasure by many politicians in South Africa and by the mining communities in Mpumalanga, for example. We know that we have, as France, we have managed to get out of coal. Other European countries are in that process. That's also why we have put up with Kenya and Barbados the comment ça s'appelle déjà? The coal transition accelerator, which is extremely important. So we had conversation with President Ramaphosa last year in Baku at the COP. We know it's difficult for South Africa more than for other countries, but we know there's a discussion about the carbon ban the European carbon ban, which is perceived negatively in South Africa. However, our South African partners and friends need to understand that it is also the expression of a determination from Europe to act swiftly, boldly, and substantially on climate change. We know that this is one of the ways that no one can avoid. We need to go that way. It has a cost. And so please bear in mind that if it has a cost for South African companies exporting to Europe, it will have, because it doesn't have that effect so far. But right now, we still have some time to adapt. It will, first of all, have a cost for European consumers because it's a tariff. So we're like a certain president who imposes taxes on his own consumers. That's what we do. We have a clear purpose. It's not about, balancing our trade deficit. It's about making sure that we pass the coal era. So the cost will be first for European consumers. And by the way, and that's something we all have to keep in mind. Because I hear, of course, we all hear criticism from South Africa. But I do remember what President Ramaphosa said. There is a domestic South African CBAM already. The only thing is that it's not super functional because the biggest sources of carbon emissions are not part of the mechanism. But we do concur with President Ramaphosa that it has to be. And we're with him. We support his policy on that. We absolutely support the orientations from President Ramaphosa to make sure that this domestic CBAM actually works. And if it does work, then it means that the European CBAM won't be necessary. It's part of the mechanism. It's important to underline that. Probably I should stop here and give the floor to others. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Am I audible? Now, am I audible? Yeah. Lovely. Thank you so much for that, Ambassador. I think it's very clear that Paris will continue to be an intact ambition. And moving on, I want to just briefly, Ambassador Francisco, can you please just give us insight as to how Brazil's presidency plans to take the baton from Baku? Baku left a lot of us without hope, and it's even now more critical for Baku to give us a people's call. And I think trust is fragile at the moment. And we're in a current environment where priorities that we expect from co-presidencies lately haven't really given us exactly what the continent needs. And I just want to get a sense of what priorities can we expect from the Brazil presidencies, and how can African countries in particular shape and align themselves to contribute to the presidency and the agenda.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to start by thanking ISS, by thanking this opportunity to discuss this topic that, of course, is of utmost importance for all of us. And Brazil being the host of COP30 this year, take, of course, a major interest in designing format that will allow for further progress. I was very happy to hear what Ambassador Martinon has said, because our priorities are very much aligned is what was done in Paris. I will start by saying that the president of COP30 will be Ambassador André Corrêa do Lago. He's a professional diplomat, seasoned diplomat in regard to climate change negotiators. He has been a negotiator for a number of years, and he has a very good transit among policymakers and those entrusted with negotiation of their accounts. So we think this bodes well for the organization of the conference. There are three priorities that have been established by the Brazilian presidency, being to reinforce multilateralism and the climate change regime in the context of UNFCCC, of course, to connect climate change regimes to people's daily lives. I think this is very important. This has been a very important aspect of for example, the Brazilian presidency of G20 last year, in which we inaugurated what we call the Social Summit, back to back with the Leaders Summit, to allow for civil society and the other engagement groups. We have 13 engagement groups ranging from business to women's, youth, that had the opportunity to contribute and make their views known. Even before the summit, they had the opportunity to provide inputs, and some of those inputs appeared in the leaders' outcome document, and we think this was a very important thing. We want to, in a way, replicate this in the context of climate change. And the third priority would be to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement by promoting actions and structural adjustments in all institutions that might contribute in that regard. We understand and we share the view that the results coming from Baku fell short of the expectations, but we also want, as friends, and also as it has been said in the beginning, to focus on the positive aspects and work towards reinforcing those aspects. We recognize the role of the global and the ample recognition of the global stock take concluded. So I want to be very faithful to the language that was proposed by the president of COP30, which, as you may know, has already issued 2 letters, open letters to the community outlining plans. We have also, through Mission 1.5, this has, as our host has highlighted at the beginning, today constitutes a consensus of what should be done. We have advanced in regard to, and we hope that COP30 will be yet another opportunity in regard to NDCs to have this overall assessment and also the enhanced transparency framework. So we have some achievements that we want to build on this. We are very much working with the Azerbaijani government in order to make sure that the Baku to Belém roadmap will be further developed and may serve as a point of support for leveraging finance, low carbon and climate resilience pathways in developing countries. And when we talk about problems facing developing countries, of course, we have the notion and the very clear understanding that Africa is one of the main targets, if not the main target. Recalling that IPCC's alerts on the urgency of climate change are centered on findings that finance, technology, international cooperation are critical enablers for accelerated climate action. If climate goals are to be achieved, both adaptation and mitigation financing will need to be further enhanced. And the reality is that there is sufficient capital, global capital, to allow for this, but also there is acknowledgement that there are barriers to directing those findings to climate change. So this is something we want to work on because we think the high cost of capital, limited fiscal space, unsustainable debt levels, high transaction costs, and conditionalities for assessing climate finance are hurdles that part of the problem that should be addressed. The proposal is that, coming from the Brazilian president, is that we work together towards turning this overall ambience of sadness and frustration into an opportunity towards constructive collective action. We think that by doing this, we can work together a future that is not dictated by climate tragedy, but by fostering resilience and agency towards a vision. We can design ourselves, not to be victims, but to be agents for transformation. And in that regard, one very concrete proposal that Brazil makes, of course, this is not a novelty in itself, as has been said, but we are proposing to reinforce the notion of working together. We are using an expression coming from the indigenous peoples that refer to we call it mutirão in Portuguese. And that means the concept of the community coming together with all resorting to all elements in the community to work towards a common goal and to meet needs that are not being addressed properly by traditional tools. We think this should lead to a bottom-up, not a hierarchical structure, but rather distributed way of doing things that will go beyond the traditional ways in which most cases, of course, there are exceptions. We have the engagement of citizens, but most cases limited to demands and to manifestations of expectations. We envision this global mutirão as an effort that will allow for each one to come forward and provide concrete actions that might assist in climate change. So we have the nationally determined contributions, but we are aiming also of having the individual and institutions determined contributions that might assist, and that can lead to a kind of global governance that will be larger than the official intergovernmental process. Of course, UNFCCC will remain the crucial setting for discussion, for negotiations, for the setting of rules according to international law. But we think it would be very important to have an overall structure that would bring together fragmented initiatives and make sure that all actors will act together, meaning business, civil society, thinkers. In that regard, the Brazilian presidency has already put in place what we call circles. We have 4 circles of actors that are called to contribute in their own within their own spheres. Let me make sure I have the right. First of all, the circle of COP presidents. We have put together a group that will be composed of the presidents of COP since Paris until last year's COP, and of course the Brazilian COP will be there. That COP of presidents is being chaired by Laurent Fabius, who was the president of the Paris COP, The idea is that to make strategic guidance to in regard to implementation of the Paris Agreement, preserves its integrity and take into account the legacy of the presidencies that have taken place in between since the Paris meeting. We also, the Brazilian presidency has also devised what we call the Circle of Peoples. And the objective is to make sure that voices that are not structurally, do not have a structural way of expressing themselves, and we are talking about indigenous peoples, African descendants in all continents. For Brazil, this is a very important topic, and traditional communities. We want to make sure that these sectors will be able to channel their concern, their experience in dealing with climate change, the traditional knowledge they have. We think it is important to have the scientific knowledge, but also make sure we have the traditional knowledge as part of the knowledge that will inform the climate action. We have also established a circle of finance ministers. And the idea is that they will meet regularly, not only finance ministers, but also, of course, experts, private sector, civil society. They will hold regular consultations and discussions on climate change. And the idea is that this group will provide input to support the COP30 presidency, and will prepare a report on the roadmap to be presented at the Belém conference on how to mobilize the target of 1.3 trillion per year by 2035. And finally, there also what is the fourth circle is what we call Global Ethical Stocktake Circle. And this refers to the initiative, a partnership that has been developed between our president, President Lula, and the United States Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And this aims to raise awareness and foster dialogue among stakeholders from different geographies, walks of life, to make sure we have a view that will lead to an ethical compass and a pragmatic guide to the global mobilization to provide further political momentum around the MDCs, promoting information integrity about climate change. This is a very important point to make sure we reinforce that initiative that also has been launched by Brazil to promote information integrity and to foster, of course, public mobilization. And the Brazilian presidency wants to reinforce coordination with Convention of Biological Diversity and desertification, with those other fora that also deal with aspects that are directly related to climate change. So to reinforce the synergy. And yeah, I will conclude. So the basic view of the Brazilian presidency is to turn what is today maybe the most prevalent view that climate change is associated to problems, to issues, to one that will lead to a vision that can provide opportunities. We understand that companies, government that will take this view, that will take into account the future and the challenges we have and prepare for this and engage in this will indeed be in the future those that will be winners in this new system. And finally, I would just refer to the very important role that we want to assign to forests. Of course, for us, it's a very important from the Brazilian perspective, some thing that we must reinforce as some kind of, I would say maybe early habits. If you can preserve forests and both from deforestation and the recovery of degraded areas, together with protection of coastal ecosystems, preserving the role of oceans, that might be actions that will allow us to, in a way, buy time in our actions toward achieving the results. So we have launched together with other partners, the United for Our Forests initiative. This is something we want to invest heavily in COP30, and of course, initiatives also related to energy, cities, technology, and innovation. So basically, the vision of the Brazilian presidency is that we are now entering a new phase in regard to NFCCC discussions, that we will be able to move from negotiations, from setting the overall basis for action and toward implementation to, let's say, it would be a post, let me refer to the exact word, a post-negotiation phase. And that we want to trigger a movement of movements, if we can say, bringing together movements that are being made by local authorities, by civil society, so to bring this together and to try to work towards overcoming the fragmentation of efforts. So this is the effort in a few words that we want to implement, take into account these the somewhat negative ambience that will be taken, but and this has been the factors that have been highlighted by the introductory remarks, but to take use of what is there positive and try to reinforce this. So basically, this is the aim of the Brazilian government, and in relation to Africa, as I said, all that is being done intends to benefit Africa in a very concrete way, because we understand that Africa faces significant challenges in regard to also the need for development that will theoretically lead to more emissions. So the Africa development is, I would say, one of our main focus that should guide climate action, to allow it to take place, but in a way that will take into account the need for low carbon climate resilience systems. So maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I have hope now. I don't know about you all, but it's giving me hope to see that the Brazilian presidency really aims to make this not just a people-centered COP, but a COP that intends to, from just policy and negotiation, to actually seeing action on the ground, especially for the African continent, in a time where now more than ever, there is a very big urgency to ensure that we act swiftly. I want to move to a civil society perspective and move to Naidoo. Can you please just give us insight as to how the continent can really assert itself and prepare for greater agency to not only shape the COPs, but the global climate narrative, and ensure that we prepare for such shifts as well, such as from the Paris Agreement, that we're not too vulnerable from such shocks. Sorry.
Thank you, Hello, and thank you for having us. To answer your question in a short way, I can say Pan-Africanism. We need to build, to rebuild the Pan-African solidarity and work collectively with other global South actors. With 2024 being the warmest year on record, I believe at this rate, African countries have one common interest, and it is climate mitigation and adaptation. because as previously mentioned that Mother Nature doesn't have time, it waits for no one. And Africa being at the receiving end of the extreme weathers, the one that gets hit the most. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. With 2024 being the warmest year on record, I believe at this rate, African countries have one common interest, and it is the mitigation and adaptation. Because we all know that Africa is at the receiving end of the extreme weathers, despite them being the less the continent that produces less carbon emissions. We experience extreme weathers compared to the big emitters. Therefore, it is time for our national governments to prioritize domestic resource mobilization. In that way, it will enable us to invest in the already underway processes of energy transition and ensure that there's an efficient energy supply towards the African countries. And then secondly, we should also look into the value addition, whereby the African continent takes advantage of its raw materials, for instance, the critical green minerals, so that we can leverage knowledge and renewable energy technology transfer, as mentioned, with other global South actors. Thank
you so much for that. I actually have a follow-up question. And it is based on your work experience in PowerShift, particularly in championing for renewable energy at PowerShift. I want to know what kind of opportunities can Africa pursue when it comes to renewable energy? And do we have the capacity to be able to do so, especially under the current geopolitical climate and funding context?
Thank you for the question. We all know that Africa possesses vast untapped renewable energy potential, especially in solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal energy, whereby in Kenya, Kenya produces at least 100 megawatts from the Lake Turkana wind power project, which is also the largest wind farm in Africa. And then secondly, here in Africa, South Africa, we also have solar PV projects that are also expanding rapidly, and they power like small communities in like for instance mini grids. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll move on. And then moving on to Egypt, there's a solar park that is considered one of the largest in the world, saving at least 1 million homes in Egypt. Therefore, these opportunities and resilient, even as geopolitical shifts, positioning Africa at the forefront of the next industrial energy transition. However, with us having all these vast opportunities, African countries, they still, I think they still, I'm looking for a better word. They're still trying to look into battery energy storage, like the battery storage, whereby the solar mini grids, they have the backup system, whereby if the sun is not shining anymore, we have the backup system of the batteries and the, yeah. So besides the vast, besides our vast renewable energies, we still have big issues to tackle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very clear that the continent has potential to tap into the untapped reserves that we do have, but also that moving forward to COP30 and as well as the UN Ocean Conference next month, there are a lot of opportunities to really drive and accelerate resilience in a way that can enable us to also move beyond the current vulnerability that we find ourselves in, where there is a lot of geopolitical shifts right now that are affecting how the continent has access to funding, is able to really stand firm in the midst of changes. And I think it's very clear, the current panel, that there is a lot of potential for the continent, but what's very critical is for us in this room to turn that potential into action, to move away from simply sitting in discussions around climate action, to actually see the work on the ground. And I think for now, we can shape the narrative and define where we move, especially under the climate regime. With the looking forward to COP30, we have an opportunity to operationalize key work on climate, such as the global stocktake, Article 6, as well as really mobilize more funding, because that's what's important, right? So I want to move on to a question and answer session, because we are running out of time, so that we can really get a broader conversation around the room. And to do so, I will invite my colleague David Willema to kindly facilitate that discussion, so that we may have a conversation that can lead to something. Please engage and ensure to contribute, and so that the conversation does not stay in a way that is rigid, but that we actually tackle the issues that we've been tackling here in a meaningful way. Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you to the panel.
Colleagues, thank you, KG, for the introduction. My name is David Willema, also from the ISS. My job is very simple this morning, and it's just to facilitate this phase, which I think is probably the most important part of this conversation. The world is so badly organized, like we've realized from this conversation, that bad events are almost a natural product. We refuse to do that here. Spaces like this are under attack increasingly. And so it is important that we speak candidly and openly in this conversation. Chatham House rules apply. So please do speak out, ask the right questions, or the difficult questions, and let's have a conversation. I would take an initial round of 4 questions or reflections. If you wish to take it that approach, we've got 1 here, but Lisa, 3, and 1 more. Okay, I'll take these 4, starting from here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then, yeah, please introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and if the question is directed to anyone, please point to them. If it's just reflections, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Fatimata Jawu Sisi. Oh, sorry. I'm the High Commissioner for the Republic of Gambia, South Africa, and all SADC countries. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute for always inviting me to their programs. And apart from being the High Commissioner, I also have interest in climate change, and I want to see that the effects of climate change, especially us, the vulnerable countries or the region Africa, which my question is based on that. The UN, and also I have listened to the French, my colleagues, the French ambassador and the Brazil, outgoing and incoming for COP. And I think you will agree that France have done a lot for Africa during your time, and which we appreciate. Thank you very much on behalf of Africa. And my question would be, as the US Paris Climate Agreement exit will hit Africa hard, and we all know that. And this morning, Professor Naidoo, if I may directly quote from him, has said, which is very important to note, that the impact, if I may quote, the impact will go beyond lower levels of financial aid and into the domains of reduced technical assistance and capacity building. So Africa will be the vulnerable region with the highest concentration of the least developed countries globally will feel the brunt immediately. And there was an interesting one, which he also said that somebody who supports Donald Trump, and that's Argentina, which is also from the area of Brazil, would be or would make a stand to follow Donald Trump on this crazy idea of making Africa suffer again unnecessarily. So I just want to know, based on what the professor has done on research with Africa, climate change, and that now you are going to come in, how do you think Brazil will be into the region of Africa, especially West Africa, where I come from, which are very, very vulnerable in climate change, especially floods and unprecedented high rains and other disasters that we do normally have within the region, especially where we are at the tropical areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner.
Hi, my name is Lisa Ott. I'm an associate professor at the University of Johannesburg. I've got two questions. The first for Ambassador Martinel. I wanted to find out about the simplification agenda that the EU is currently embarking on and the criticism that has generated from some quarters around the climate agenda, and just your sense on how we kind of locate the climate agenda within the current dispensation of the EU and the agenda that they're pursuing more broadly. The second question is for Nothandazo. So I think that the kind of recommendations that you give around Pan-Africanism and kind of African bloc is something that a lot of countries have sought for a long time, but we know from history that Africa tends not to act as a bloc. My question is, why will climate change be the issue that causes it to do so? And I think the context behind that is that I think we know the challenges that Africa face. Of course, Africa is not a monolith, and I won't repeat all those challenges. But I think for many countries, we also know that policy is not made for 10, 15, 20, 100 years in the future. Policy tends to happen in 5-year electoral cycles. And for that reason, I think we see slow movement on climate issues because the more pertinent thing for government is to address bread and butter issues. I think my question is just how do we generate that political will to kind of result in an African bloc on climate? Thank you.
Lisa.
Good morning. My name is Itumeleng, from the University of Pretoria, postdoc student. Just a reflective little bit that will turn into a question. I'm from a very small town in the Free State. In my childhood, people used to use anthracite for heating, cooking, and so forth. And I remember winter was particularly a different season, even with the smell of the town. By 5 o'clock, everything was almost white and misty. You could mistakenly not say it's not winter because at the time it comes, the evening is very, very cold. You could see the blooming of the smoke then. Then electricity came in the 90s. Everything changed. The smoke went away. The smell went away. people bought stoves and all that. Lung disease dropped a little bit. But while we were during the smoking days, nobody made a noise about it. It was almost like normal. It's just life as it is. And what can we do? There is nothing that we can do. Now with the new technologies, the green energies that are being sold now, I'm not hearing much about the drawbacks of this new technologies that we are now expected to migrate towards. Are there any findings of the insalubrious effects that they could be having? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more and then we'll give answers to this round. The people that have questions noted, just keep them like hot onto your fire for the next round.
Morning. My name is Kimberly Malope. I am one of the youngest award-winning international motivational speakers. I am a recent young diplomat graduate from the Academy for International Business Officials in China. I'm an SDG advocate, and I also am an advocate for the youth. I have a few questions, actually. I have a question for each member on the panel. The first one is for Ambassador Martin. How can African governments ensure that climate-related policies are inclusive and consider the voices of marginalized youth, especially those in rural areas? And then the second question I have is for Ambassador Benedicto. Sorry, my outfit has been failing me the whole way. How can Africa ensure it has a stronger, unified voice in global climate negotiations, like COP conferences, especially the young people? And the last one is for Sisilo Mtandazo. How can young African entrepreneurs be supported to develop local, innovative solutions for renewable energy and sustainable agriculture? Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting questions. May I please ask that the responses be as succinct as possible and the questions themselves so that we give as many people a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I understand that I have more or less 3 questions to answer. How can I put it? So do you mind, Professor, if I focus on I'm not super aware of this simplification agenda from the European Union, my bad. But what I can confirm is that there is no backing down in terms of objectives on the side on the part of the European Union. There is a strong determination to actually implement CBAM, provided there is a temporary, a provisional, and so sort of an interim time during which we try to understand what is at stake, what has to be measured, what is to be taken into account in the calculation of the tax. But again, as I said earlier, we consider it as consistent with domestic CBAM. So on your question, sir, we believe in renewable energies. We believe in decarbonized energy. And we keep in mind that only renewable energies will never be fully reliable because they are intermittent sources of energy. Maybe not at all time here in Africa and in South Africa in particular, but in my country, I have to say that there is not wind every day, there is not sun every day, and we always have the storage challenge that you mentioned. So that's why I'm just talking about my country, in the French energy mix, nuclear has a huge part as a base load, and it works like that. Having said that, so you mentioned earlier that in Southern Africa, there is an incredibly high potential for building entirely decarbonized energy in South Africa, in Lesotho, in Malawi. You know, Lesotho, for example, could become very quickly a powerhouse in terms of entirely decarbonized energy, based on hydro, based on nuclear,
solar and wind, with the support of microgrids, because obviously the geography in Lesotho does not allow quickly on the short term to have immense grids, but that can work. French companies are here in South Africa building solar farms, wind farms, batteries based on storage solutions based on hydro, which called STEP, which means that when there is an excess of energy, either it's wasted or you store it. So you can actually, thanks to building dams, you can actually store energy by bringing up water. And when the grid is not monopolized by energy, when there is a need for energy, you can recreate that energy by letting the water down. So coming back to your point, so we're talking entirely decarbonized energy. I would like, if you allow me, to pick up on one thing you mentioned, and that I would like to take to insist on the necessity to pass the coal era. The cost of remaining in an economy based on coal is still incredibly high in terms of health, public health, that you mentioned, that you went through during your childhood. So health, bad fuels, bad toxic fuels, but also misuse of water. It seems that we're getting out of a La Nina year, meaning that there is an excess of water in Gauteng, in Cape Town, in Western Cape Province. But we know that we will face a scarcity of water. Remaining in the coal economy will have, as a consequence, will necessitate a huge amount of water. And using that water to operate coal plants will lead to a misuse of water, leading to water that will be damaged, more toxic. And that's something we need to keep in mind. And there was another. Could you please remind me your question in 1 second?
How can I? Sorry. So I was asking you, how can African governments ensure climate related? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So, what could governments in Africa do? I'm not their spokesperson, and I don't want to appear as giving advice or even lecturing African governments. What I can tell you is what we are doing to accompany the energy transition notably in South Africa. We are trying to make it as just as possible as partners. So that's why the French government, for example, has loaned not less than 700 million euros for the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And we are also doing that in Kenya, and we are also doing that in other countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. It's a long process, but as you said rightly, we are focusing on making it as just as possible. So that's why we, with our partners from the Just Energy Transition Partnership, Germany, Britain, the European Union, now Denmark, the Netherlands, in a way, Spain and Canada, and yes, indeed, not the US anymore. We have committed more than $10 billion or euros. It's better to speak in euros. It's better bargain. To accompany the process, to make sure that, for example, the mining communities in Mpumalanga can build something else. We are also supporting the federations of miners so that they get the skills to be part of the process. So that's the kind of thing we're doing.
Oh, thank you. I also try to be brief. First, about the question about Brazil's approach and initiatives towards Africa, especially West Africa. I repeat what I said, that all actions that we take have Africa concerns into account. We are, as a developing country, facing similar challenges. We can sympathize and have a total adherence to requests from Africa in that regard. So I'd say that it is very much in our thoughts. Of course, concrete actions, concrete initiatives are to be developed, I think, according to this overall strategy proposed, also to include elements from society, business, to devise ways to tackle. I've not ventured, as Pastor Martinon, to engage into concrete. I think that depends very much on a case-by-case basis according to each country, resources and availability of alternatives. And this is something I want to address, because one aspect that is frequently overlooked in this discussion, we talk much about the need for finance, for technology, capacity building, of course. These are very important things, but I think one element that is in the provides for the basis for these needs are the need to provide economic alternatives to countries and to devise ways in which development, poverty can be eradicated in a way that takes into account climate action. Since we are talking under Chatham rules, I would say there are many contradictions within each country, even developing countries. I would mention, for example, my own country, in which there is a huge effort toward deforestation, because there is an understanding that this is key to keep temperature, to contribute to the 1.5 goal. But at the same time, there are very powerful actors that go against this. Talking, for example, economic actors that want to get into the forest to develop agriculture, livestock. So it is also an internal problem. Also in regard to oil production, at this very moment, there is a large discussion in Brazil because some reserves are found near the north, close to the Amazon River, and there is a huge interest on states that are close to develop this, because that would be an alternative of development. Though those are very poor, it's a very poor region, and they see it as an alternative for development of people that live there. So there are contradictions within countries that are also very much, play a very much strong influence in this. That requires the development of alternatives. We are thinking that, for example, biotechnology, sustainable forest management can be tools for that. But we must not forget, for the Amazon region is larger than West Europe. So it is, even to enforce legislation, we need more resources, we need more elements. There are some parts of the Amazon that can only be reached by only the army goes there to provide assistance, because they are so remote, and so there are many challenges and many forces that within countries work against some of those efforts. This is also something that should be taken into account. Of course, we are talking about developing green economy, but technology, finance, and capacity building are not solutions per se. They need to be invested in a way that takes into account the need to develop economic alternatives. And in regard to the negative aspects of those technologies, I think this is a very important point. Also, some of the solutions that are being proposed should be further investigated. For example, we talk much about electric cars, but to develop the electricity for those electric cars, there it might be not sustainable and provide also harm to the environment. The same applies to dams. In my country, we rely very much on hydropower, but there is a huge questioning about the role of dams and the damage they produce, socioeconomic damage to communities that are affected have to be withdrawn from the region, even the emissions coming from those. So there are always, let's say, trade-offs that should be investigated, and negative aspect. This is a very important part. And in regard to African agency within FSC, we think there is a very important role for the African Union to work as a unified. We understand there are so many issues within African Union and maybe not a unity, but we think climate change might be one of the areas around which African Union can develop a unified position. And that also, I think another point of importance is that not only governments, but also civil society and other actors will be fully engaged from that, because this provides a very important basis and legitimacy to the requests. I recall, for example, that in his previous administration, President Trump was initially very much reluctant to allow for vaccines, but I think the overall environment, even without the United States, led him to at least not oppose. So that's the creation of this global conscience within that shows also the engagement of civil society is very important for developments to take place. Thank you.
So much. Before I turn to you, Ambassador Martinan has to leave us for another engagement. I want to thank you for reminding us that we need to move ahead and the power of partnerships. If I can, before you go, just 30 seconds, any parting words?
I love you.
That's great. That's what we need. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer the first question on Pan-Africanism, I'll simply say that we'll have to make use of our critical green minerals as a foundation to bring us together, whereby we come together and look into export policies and Pan-African industrialization policy. Because we all know that Africa has lots of green minerals, critical green minerals being exported to the outside continents or countries, but we still suffer the lack of electricity. Therefore, we have to take advantage of the minerals. We have to leverage the minerals, the richness that we have, and come together as the African countries and make finance from those minerals to curb, or if I can say, to mitigate and adapt to the current climate change. And then secondly, just to answer it shortly, we have to give the youth a chance towards participating in the decision-making spaces. You'll be surprised in the innovative ideas the youth have towards creating a sustainable future for themselves, but they don't have that space at the moment. So I believe that we first have to create a space for them to contribute ideas towards the sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. Yes. Please put your report and ask you to sit. Okay. To answer some questions. I'm gonna engage our online audience, and I'll take 3 final questions, and then we can continue the conversation over lunch. Start from there, take one day, and I take for Elise, and finally there. So, you know what? Let me read the online ones first, very quickly. Cool. Nintendo, there's a question for you. When we speak of energy storage, why is the focus so much on batteries and not more on hydraulic pump station storage? Because according to this person's calculations, pump stations will always be far more cost effective than battery or hydrogen storage. There's a question from Kristen from the Daily Maverick. I'll direct this to Dhesigen. As the US exits the Paris Agreement, what does it mean for Africa and especially South Africa's climate future, particularly how it affects access to finance, adaptation, and mitigation measures on the continent, and how big is the gap that now needs to be filled? There's another question, Ambassador, if you could take this one, that in light of the geopolitical tensions in the world and the fact that the two biggest polluters, China and the US, are being reluctant to stop, more of the focus has to shift to the adaptation measures, because without China and the US, mitigation is not going to happen as it should. I think this is more of a reflection than a question. So I'll leave it at that, and then, yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Snetlandla. I'm with the UN and I'm an energy advisor there. So I just perhaps make a comment and then I'll ask the question. Okay. So I think it was you that asked about Africa and how we can be able to organize. And I do think that the G20 provides an opportunity moment for us as a continent, particularly because of the priorities that our presidency has actually established. Priority 3, focusing on African connectivity and power pools. And there's a great deal of work that is happening, not only with the technical partners, whether it be effort, but also the African focus that this presidency has taken on. I know that our minister is actively engaging with other energy ministers to be able to say, how do we realize this vision? And I do think that from even looking at multilateralism, even though it is under attack, there is a lot of encouragement to be able to draw from that. And I know that even from an African Union point of view, they are in support in terms of how can they, as a bloc, also support Africa to be able to realize that. It is not without its challenges, but the opportunities are certainly there. And I do think that even though multilateralism is under attack, I think that there is an emboldenment that actually just looks back at our history to say that there has been so much to be able to draw on from the positive spin-offs and developments that we've achieved over time. So I'm going to then come back to my question, which is for you, Ambassador, because you'd actually touched on it already and talking about the complexities of the transition. So I do think that we don't focus enough on the complexities that actually speak to what it means to be able to transition to lower carbon energy sources. I don't hear enough about the circular economy around what do we do at the end of life. You know, we talk about the opportunities, but there hasn't been enough as far as I'm concerned. And I look to everywhere around this. What is a circular or circularity look like in this economy? I mean, thankfully, you've already touched on the hydrogen power. Those the underbelly of that particular technology is well documented, but it is still part of the energy mix that we punt as an alternative. And what does that look like from a global South point of view, particularly from an African point of view? I think I want to be able to stress more around the circularity. I come from an oil and gas sector. That's where I spent a huge chunk of my career. And there's huge learnings that I think we can take from there. CCS, which is carbon capture storage, is a technology that had been invested in for multitude of years and at a great significant cost. It is yet to be able to yield the returns that have been plowed into that. And so that's why I do think it is important that we sit with the discomfort of what circularity means for this industry at this point in time. And so that we don't actually start talking about it at an end of life point of view, because then we're not drawing on the lessons of the current industries that are dominant. Okay, thanks.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Very quickly, my brother.
Most of the, my points could have been just covered, for the SDG 13. So, Baba, I think the BRICS mission, do we think the BRICS mission isn't putting all the strides? Whilst, the EV market target race for 2030, we see the European automobile companies are leading to the US because they want to go compete with Tesla and whatnot. So, as do you think the Chinese mobility hindrance of the Indians would also play part the processes? After Donald Trump took flight for farming labor skill agriculture, do we still have to organize our biodiversity as a country, especially with this moment of the G20 chair, but also for AU sister? I think if it's coming, decided to stand as a non-numerated member for G20, could have a voice for all the issues that are affecting SDG 13. But thanks for Prince Williams pulling the slides for public mobilization. The enterprise was kicked up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. Do you promise to ask your question and then to be second?
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Sikati Mahama from the International Water Management Institute. My question was for the ambassador of France, but then he left, so now it's for the broader room. And it also links to the complexities of the transition and more so the conflict that's going to come with the transition. So I just wanted to ask both to the panel and to the room, is anyone thinking of the conflict that will come with the transition? And if so, what are the measures that we are taking to combat conflict, which may escalate to violence? And I'm thinking particularly about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and how relations between Egypt and Ethiopia are just being affected. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. 25.
Okay, sorry.
Elise, we come to you.
Make it brief. So Alice Leroux from the African Futures and Innovation team here at ISS. We do a lot of long-term forecasts, and a lot of that is energy related and climate related. Our energy forecasts are clear that Africa will double its carbon emissions in the next 20 years. So Africa leaders, we know, are grappling with this, their energy mix, how to diversify. So this really was, I'm very sad that the French ambassador left, because I wanted to touch on nuclear and the role of nuclear energy in Africa's future, because I don't think we're talking enough about that and asking the right questions. But I think my next question is then for the ambassador of Brazil. I think your country has a very unique energy mix, be it hydro and biofuels. And I think there are many African countries that can benefit from the lessons that you've learned in Brazil. I'm thinking of the DRC, and they are struggling to get their big, large projects off the ground. These are environmental problems, political problems, financial problems. Are we having these South-South cooperation discussions around these lessons learned? And are we having the right conversations to support these African countries in terms of how do you diversify given the resources that you have? And not all countries will have hydro, not all will have solar, not all will have wind.
And nuclear, what is the role of nuclear in Africa's future? But that question may be more for Dhesigen than the hydro question for the ambassador.
Thank you so much, Elise. You have the pleasure of asking the last question.
Thanks. I'll do so. So this is David from Mobilize. The thing I wanted to focus on, and I was really hoping the French ambassador could respond as well, but I'm very happy for the whole panel to respond. I want to talk a little bit about adaptation and the finance of adaptation. And I think it would be safe to say that prior to the US formally exiting the Paris Agreement, there still wasn't really that much focus on adaptation versus mitigation. And with, I think, the way Naidoo was presenting at the start, adaptation is becoming more and more urgent in its need. So to go into specifics there, in terms of financing adaptation, particularly in, shall we say, global South countries, what are sort of the thoughts on what is possible in terms of debt versus grant making to finance that? Because I think a lot of it at the moment, the conversation is how does the global North provide accessible debt? But I think when we think of it in the broader context, there is a debt the global North owes the global South in terms of how much of the global CO2 emissions or carbon emissions came from the global North. But what is the appetite in that environment as far as we understand it? What are the kind of advocacy points movements and organizations need to push to really get the narrative shifted and get commitments for not just debt provided to the global South to finance adaptation, but actual grants or particularly considering some of the delicacies in the North, a reparative sort of discussion or argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Panelists, a minute and a half each, a minute to answer the question, 30 seconds to give final reflections. If you may, I'll shift the order and start with you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I agree with those that express the understanding that adaptation today is the most urgent task at hand, and also to the complexities of transition. As I have mentioned, there are even internal contradictions within not only developing countries. We see in the US, for example, renewed push for exploration of oil and gas, also aiming at developing regions and so on. And of course, there are powerful economic interests behind this. So this is a major thing that should be addressed. In regard to BRICS and G20, I would mention that climate change is a topic that is at the forefront of all discussions within any group, be it G7, BRICS, G20. We understand that G20 has a potential to develop some kind of global understanding because in G20 you have BRICS, you have G7. Of course, one thing that diminishes this understanding is that today we have one party that is trying to block, and since the decisions are taken by consensus, it is not very optimistic to wait for inputs coming from those settings. But anyway, we keep pushing for that. The role of nuclear in the mix within the countries, of course, Brazil relies on hydropower, biofuels, and we have been cooperating with African countries. One thing that we must be very frank is that the initiatives are sometimes localized, country-driven, addressed to particular countries. One of the obstacles is also Brazil being a developing country has a limited capacity also to engage in cooperation. The resources for that do not meet, I'd say, the expectations of Africa as a whole. But anyway, we have recently set up units in a special mission in Addis Ababa, working with the EU to try to enlarge cooperation with Africa as a whole. And of course, some of those solutions can be applied to some countries, but not to others. Brazil, we have large rivers, a very large potential for this that has been explored, which is not the case, for example, in South Africa, where there are not so many rivers. So solutions will be different on a case by cases, depending on countries. And in regard to that, I would say it is also, it is one of the priorities that were established by South Africa. But it is also, it's not an easy task, because also we must think that the financial institutions, they have their rules, they have their also needs to provide results for. And, but this is also an area we want to push. And one thing that is very important also for Africa, I would say, is to, and this is also a priority established by the South African G20 presidency, is to explore the role that critical minerals can play, especially from the perspective of adding value to what is being coming from Africa. Not, and this is also a concern of Brazil, not only to export raw materials, but also to put some more value, to engage in a value chain in a more rewarding way for the countries. So I would maybe leave. And my final comments is that in spite of all of this, I agree with what you have said in the beginning. In spite of all of this, we must continue. There's no alternative. We must explore the positive achievements we have. There are some very important achievements. We must build on this. And this is our perspective. We have to enlarge our discussion and includes all actors working under this concept of multi-round, that each one will bring to the discussion its contribution, and we'll try to have a more systematic, system-wide approach, not only from a governmental perspective, but also we try to have some kind of global government that will assist us, take into account the geopolitical constraints, but even though we think we must not lose our optimism and our push for these things to happen. Thank you.
Just to answer the battery storage question, I do acknowledge other energy storage techniques. The reason why I focus on the battery storage is because currently the mini grid solar systems are currently on the lead towards the green energy transition in Africa. So yeah, I do acknowledge other forms of energy storage. Thank you.
Any parting words?
No, nothing. Thank you.
You don't love us?
Yeah, no, not really.
Okay, as swiftly as I can. Maybe I should use the space to answer custom. The withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement is a significant move, a very big one. And in addition to that, the United States has already announced its withdrawal from the JET partnerships, the Just Energy Transition partnerships, not only in South Africa, but to all of them. And that means that a potential funding pipeline is no longer there. In addition to that, there is the pressure that they're going to put on oil and gas players to actually increase investments in oil and gas. But here's the bottom line around this. Although in the short term, the numbers will be significant, without a doubt, there is a general absence of the things that I think we were really worried about. The first is that there would be an immediate copycat effect from other partners. This has not happened. The reality has gone in the other direction. So, for example, with the Just Energy Transition, we now have new partners in many of the players' constituencies, including South Africa, not a reduction of the number of partners. The second thing we thought would happen is that there would be a policy maneuvering inside the multilateral development banks around their financing of energy transition and climate resilience projects. This too has not happened. And this is an arena where the United States administration has gigantic influence. And then further than that, if you look at what's happening in the commercial bank sector, there hasn't been a knock-on effect in that direction also. There also has not been a reduction of the internal investment in the United States on renewable energy with any kind. Nobody has put their hand up to repeal the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So what we're looking at here, and maybe it's early days, is that this cascading effect that was possible has not happened. So there is some short-term inconvenience, but it looks like the longer-term sustainability is still more than practical. And this is something I think we can bank on. There's lots more to react to, but I'll do my final remark. And my final word is this, it does look now like there are more obstacles on the roads than they were a year ago. It really looks that way. And I think part of that is the shock factor. Because when we put that into the algorithms and the equations, I think we're going to realize that you can replicate that for every one of the 9 years since COP21. That it looks different, it looks sharper, it looks more jagged, it looks more in your face, but it's just another set of obstacles to get by. If you like, there were 20 potholes in the road and now there are 22. You still got to get past them. And the second point is that nobody has put on the table a vision for a sustainable, high carbon future. It's just not possible. You can delay it. You cannot have an alternative. There's only one direction to go. And my parting word is thanks a lot to the participation today. It's been inspiration. Thank you very much.
It's a wrap up. Other reflections from the French embassy. Passing to Alex, standing in for Ambassador Ahmed.
Thank you, David. And I'm Alexandre Blanchard, I'm the Global Affairs Counselor at the French Embassy. So hearing that so many complaints about the absence of the ambassador, I'll try to address some of the questions through because they reflect actually some of the French priorities for the themes that we discussed. The first element is on conflict management over natural resources, which is a question which was addressed by our International Water Management Authority colleague. I can't, of course, express myself on the Great Renaissance Dam itself, but what we can highlight in terms of multilateral negotiations is the methodology we use. You will notice that over the past 10 years, and I think this is also an inheritance of the Paris Agreement, inclusivity in the climate and biodiversity negotiations have progressed, and they have become over and over a cornerstone of the way of moving forward. The ambassador of Brazil also addressed the issue on the way that we face and will see the negotiations being put through at COP30. And France has been at the forefront of this movement by promoting, wherever possible, a multi-stakeholder approach. This is, for example, what President Macron has set up with the One Planet Summits, which have tackled environmental, climate issues, also oceans. And in doing so, we have more and more heard voices from civil society, but also from maybe the private sector, from think tanks and other communities on how to engage better with handling natural resources. And one example I can give is of the new forestry partnership conservation that, for example, France launched with Gabon, I think it was 2 years ago, which is an innovative way of protecting those huge and so precious forestry basins as the Amazon forest, but also the forests in Africa and Asia, in a way that's sustainable for local communities, but that also does not hamper our collective future. So this kind of leads me to the second point, which is that this multi-stakeholder approach has also been at the center of an initiative that President Macron co-chaired with Kenya and Barbados, which is the Paris Pact for people and the planet. And this leads me to the question of debt that you so addressed, which is of course extremely important. And the ambassador of Brazil again recalled the fact that South Africa made it one of its G20 priorities. If you listen to President Ramaphosa, it's one of the first things that he's putting forward actually. And France stands very much in support of its priority among the other ones, precisely because one of the key objectives of what we call the 4P is to say that no country should have to face the dilemma of addressing poverty and fighting poverty on the one hand, and on the other hand, fighting climate change, both through mitigation and adaptation measures. And a way of solving that is to put forward the innovative mechanisms that we have been working on over the last decade, precisely. So Tess, you mentioned the MDVs, as well as yourself, Ambassador. It's interesting to notice that indeed the World Bank pursued with its new agenda of faster, bigger, better, that we now have new financial instruments to address those, climate catastrophe issues through sustainable refinancing. For example, the debt climate swaps, which were forward again by the Prime Minister of Barbados. So there is a whole load of solutions that, again, we have to look through and develop in the light of the US withdrawal. And just to conclude on nuclear, because this is an extremely important point, also probably for the future of the continent, what I can highlight is that the dynamic to put forward nuclear energy is clearly here at the multilateral stage. For example, at COP28 in Dubai, France, among 28 other countries, such as Ghana, for Africa, for example, signed a declaration to triple energy commitments by 2030. It is a way forward. It needs to see how we can concretely implement it, but it shows you that there's really this push for nuclear energy going. Thank you, David.
Okay. For a very engaging session. And finally, to the man standing between all of us and lunch. Right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian. I lead the work of climate change at the CSIR here in Pretoria. It's not easy what I've been asked to do, so I'm going to try to do it in 3 minutes. I've got about 6 points that I want to share with you that I picked up as my personal sense of the conversation today. The first one is multilateralism. There were many phrases that we used to describe it, but to me, that's the first thematic issue that stood out for me is there's something happening in multilateralism that we should respond to. There were words like it's under attack, but what I thought to me that the phrase that captured my mind the most was actually said in passing by Gauke. She said, trust is fragile. And to me, that's where we are currently with multilateralism, is that there's legal trust between countries currently. And that is an elephant in the room for me. Secondly, the second point that caught my attention was to listen to the French ambassador defending the CPAM. I couldn't, what's the right word? put it this way, the more he spoke, the more I disagreed with him, to put it bluntly. And precisely because it is by design dangerous for the economy of this country. And it's unilateral. That's what it makes it not workable. But it was useful for me to listen to him putting flowers around it. The third issue that I picked up was the issue of these critical minerals. I link it with one of the points that the professor from UJ mentioned. I think her name is Professor Lisa. That Africa tends not to act as a bloc. That's a big statement. Don't know whether it's factual or not, but recently, about 2 weeks ago, at the BRICS summit, African countries not agree on which countries to put forward for African permanent seat in the UN Security Council. African countries themselves did not agree amongst each other. So this issue of critical minerals, how do countries, African countries, take advantage of the presence of critical minerals in our countries? We didn't talk much about the how part. We didn't talk much about how the presence of these critical minerals are going to trigger the Pan-Africanism. We've always had minerals in this continent. They didn't trigger Pan-Africanism. Why now are the critical minerals expected to do so? But that I'm just reflecting what I had. Second, last point, 2 questions on going forward in these conversations for me is about the role of nuclear in Africa that Alice asked. There are many views about nuclear, but it is part of the energy mix that the continent should be thinking about. So going forward, we need to be talking about that. The second question is what the lady from IWMI mentioned about the conflicts of the transitions. We celebrate just transitions. I think it's a wonderful phenomenon. Personally, I'm a strong proponent of it. But indeed, we don't talk enough about what are the possible conflicts associated with it. In conclusion, I was reminded that it's 10 years since we agreed the Paris Agreement. And to the Brazilian ambassador, it was good for me to hear that Ambassador Andrea is going to be president of the COP. During the days I was a negotiator, there were 2 Andreas from Brazil. We didn't know their surnames. So we called one of them Tall Andrea and the other one Short Andrea. So the one who is now the president of COP is the Tall Andrea. So we're looking forward to the COP at the end of the year. My personal view is that there is no alternative to climate action. It's not even an option. We may be derailed, we may delay, but we need to insist on this pathway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll bring it to a close. Our conversations can continue right outside this door while we have lunch. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.